Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Time is small, is too far to walk alone. You can't do it on your own. It's like bare hands digging through stone. And if things go down much steeper hills, even money won't pay these bills. But time is sure to show that people gonna be okay. Storms never come to stay. They just show us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. And the trials of today, there are signs along the way to remind us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. Sometimes feels like I'm drifting a million miles from this planet. But what a shame it would be to look back on my life and realize that I've taken you and you for granted. People gonna be okay. Storms never come to stay. They just show us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. And the trials of today, there are signs along the way to remind us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. And I can't see what's a mile around the bend. I do not know where this world is headed or where it may end. But you gave me this smile, so I threw away my frown. And I ain't gonna pick up, no you don't pick up what you just put down. People gonna be okay. Storms never come to stay. They just show us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. And the trials of today, there are signs along the way to remind us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. Are people gonna be okay? Storms never come to stay. They just show us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. And the trials of today, there are signs along the way to remind us how bad we need each other, how bad we need each other. And I need you more than I'll let it show. And you need me more than you know. We can walk one single mile alone. I need you so long. That was the one.
There are many ways we collaborate with each other to be the church we're called to be and to serve how we serve. And our contributing financially is one of the most important of those ways. If you want to help fund and sustain what we get to do together, go to crosspoint.org/contribute to see the many simple ways that you can do so. You can even text crosspointenc to 77977 to receive a link to get started now. Thank you for your partnership in the work we do together.
Hey Crosspointe, I want to let you know about something really exciting. If you are a post-college 20s, 30s, something, we want to invite you to join us for lunch after the services on September 15th for an informational session. We are starting a new group just for you, and we would love your input. So we invite you, again, to join us September 15th after the service at about 11:30 in the community room at Crosspointe. And if you would let us know you're coming, that would let us know how much food that we need to get. So you can do that at crosspoint.org/youngadults. And again, post-college 20-somethings to 30-somethings or whatever, we invite you to join us for lunch on September 15th. Thanks so much. So there has been a lot of talk these days. A lot of political talk, a lot of talk about how bad things have gotten, how good things could be. There's been a lot of insults thrown. There have been a lot of things assumed and then spoken aloud before they're confirmed. There's been a lot of talk in my own head, a lot of talk, and there's going to be a lot more. We are at the height of talking season. Ecclesiastes says a fool multiplies words, which I think is one way of saying don't talk too much. And the Proverbs say the tongue has the power of life and death, which means I should probably give more thought to the things that come out of my mouth, if they're that powerful. And the passage I want to dig into today is an ancient one, and it's got a lot of talk in it. It's found in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 25. And there's three main characters in this story. David, who would later become the famous king of Israel, but at this point in the story, he's just a guy with a lot of dreams. This is the same David who we are introduced to a few chapters earlier, who is this resourceful, impulsive teenage shepherd who is infamous for stepping in when no one else would and killing the giant Goliath with a single stone from his slingshot. Well, in this chapter, we find David with 600 mercenaries dodging King Saul, who wants him dead, and he's making a living off of kind of running this protection racket. He would, and his men, mostly without asking first, watch guard the properties of the wealthy and the vulnerable in exchange for food, supplies, shelter, payment. You might consider it extortion. If I see you in the wilderness, as long as you provide for me and my men, we won't harm you, we will even protect you. But if you don't, well, you'll probably need protection from us. David was bold and brash. He lived in the wild and he acted like it. And this chapter begins after David and his men had spent some time not harming the servants and the livestock of the second character in this narrative, a wealthy man named Nabal. And it's made clear from the start that Nabal was a vile man. His name can be translated something like worthlessness or son of worthlessness. It comes from the Hebrew root Nabal, N-B-L, which is used to depict all sorts of bad behavior and foolishness, not limited to abuse and sacrilege, disorderly conduct, even assault. Nabal was a bumbling, foolish, offensive man. He was full of himself. He was full of worthless talk, unliked by anybody around him, and he was unwilling to listen to anything but the sound of his own voice. Now, Abigail is the chief protagonist in this story, and in contrast to her husband, Nabal, whose name represented all things foolish and abrasive, Abigail's name translates as my father's joy. She is only one of 7 women in the Hebrew Bible considered a prophet. And she's the only woman to be described as both intelligent and beautiful. Some rabbis consider her one of 4 most beautiful women in the world. And some said that even just the thought of Abigail could make someone just be overcome with lust. Apparently, she was gorgeous. The Hebrew Torah said that it was unbecoming for a king to have too many wives. But there was an exception for some commentators. They said that if the women that the king wanted had traits like Abigail, then there was no reason to limit the number of wives he could have. Apparently, the more women like Abigail, the merrier. Like many women in the Bible, Abigail's story is short but powerful. She used her cunning, her beauty, her intelligence to promote peace, prevent needless bloodshed, and according to some, prophesy the future of a king. So let's read a bit of the story, and I'm going to stop in between. We're going to talk a bit about it. So there was a man in Maon whose property was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. The woman was clever and beautiful, but the man was surly and mean. He was a Calebite. So we're introduced to Nabal's wealth and possessions before we're given his name, indicating that the author didn't believe Nabal's life was as valuable as his property. On the other hand, we're told Abigail's name, which is a representation of her character, before anything else. Nabal is described as a Calebite, which is either a rival tribe of Judah, or it's like calling him something like a Vanderbilt, depending on who you ask and which commentary you use. So here's the rest. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and to go to Nabal and greet him in my name. Thus you shall salute him. Peace be to you, and peace be to all your house, and peace to all that you have." Get the idea that he wants some peace. "I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing in all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your sight, for we have come on feast day. Please give us whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." And when David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. But Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is this son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and have my water and the meat that I have butchered for my shearers and give it to the men who come here from I don't know where?" Okay, so it's not likely, but perhaps Nabal honestly didn't know who David was. Probably not. More likely, he was feigning in ignorance and insulting David by insinuating that he and his men were insignificant, nothing more than runaway servants who belonged to someone else, vagabonds, riffraff, terrorists, troublemakers, unworthy of his acknowledgement. And as you can imagine, like all of us who enjoy a good insult, David took that so well. He didn't. This is what David said. He said, "Every man strap on his sword." And every one of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword, and about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. And one of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing." They didn't steal anything. "Night and day, they were a wall around us. They protected us the whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He's such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." So the servants watched David's response and saw this violent writing on the wall. David was seeing red and planned to wipe out Nabal. The last time somebody had spoken to him like that, he killed him with a rock to the forehead. Now he had an army of men and an even bigger ego. Who did Nabal think he was? Didn't he know who David was? David riled up his men and began marching down the mountainside to show Nabal just what happened when you spoke to David like that. Nabal's talk had paved a path toward deadly violence, and David's talk made matters worse. The servants didn't even bother warning Nabal the foolish. They went straight to Abigail the intelligent. And Abigail understood immediately that she had to take matters into her own hands. She understood the coming consequences of her foolish husband's refusal or inability to think before he spoke. There had been a lot of talk. Now somebody needed to act. Now, knowing that no one is really on their best behavior when they're hangry, Abigail had an elaborate feast prepared and sent ahead to David, hoping that the way to his heart, or at least the way to calm him down, was actually through his stomach. And Abigail, she could have sat home, sent the message and the feast with a servant, and waited to see what happened. But instead, she put herself at considerable personal risk and followed behind the feast. And she ran the speech of her life she was about to give to David over and over again in her head, because this was going to be a moment of life and death. She was a beautiful and vulnerable woman meeting an angry mob boss who was out for blood on a mountain pathway. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it wasn't long until she ran into David on the path, who was still angrily muttering to himself. And he said, "Surely it is in vain that I protected all this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, but he has returned me evil for good. God do so to David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him." Now, we need to know the literal translation here to fully grasp just how angry he was. The literal translation of verse 22 is actually, God do so to David if I leave so much as one wall pisser alive. Excuse me. Because for the more sensitive ear, they retranslated wall pisser to simply say male. But he was mad. David was livid. The feast hadn't softened him up. So the summer before my sophomore year in college, I went and spent a month in Wuhan, China. I was with a few other students, and we went down a side street in search of some really delicious sticky rice that was wrapped in these grape leaves and steamed and sold from carts on the side of the streets. They were delicious. Well, about a week or two before we arrived in China, the US government accidentally bombed a Chinese embassy, and a lot of people died. And so protests erupted all around China, or all around the country. And we actually, before we came, had to change the city we were staying in because the other one was too dangerous and too violent. But we were young, white, American students who thought we were invincible and hadn't thought so much about how our unbothered presence might come across. So as we stood in the streets, eating our sticky rice, an older woman pointed at us and she began shouting. Now, our friend knew enough Mandarin to understand that this woman was upset about the bombing. Within a matter of seconds, we were surrounded by dozens of people, all shouting and pointing and crowding and angry. There was no exit. Well, one of the students I was with had sense enough not to panic. And in the midst of the chaos, she calmly took the hands of the older woman in hers. She looked her in the eye and simply said, "I'm sorry." And that was it. Almost immediately, the woman calmed, which calmed the crowd. She gave my friend a hug. And in a matter of seconds, we were standing alone on the street again with our sticky rice, like nothing had happened, except that we would never be the same. And from then on, we had a very different take on Chinese-American relations and followed it closely. Talk had rallied an angry crowd, and talk had brought about peace in that situation. And as Abigail met David, her actions shifted to eloquent, peaceful, and strategic speech. Abigail acted like a diplomat. Abigail bowed to David as one would bow to a king. She played to David's ego. She called him Lord and Prince. She apologized for the foolishness of her husband's talk, which took a lot of humility because that wasn't her fault. Then, in what would later be considered prophecy, Abigail reminded David of the man he was trying to be, of the man he could be. She told him she knew he was going to be a wonderful king someday. But she warned him that if she let one foolish man's talk push him to revenge and murder of an entire household, he would forever carry blood guilt, the murder of innocents on his hands. And blood guilt would raise considerable questions about his fitness to be king, and it might even prohibit it. Now, maybe Abigail's speech was prophetic. Maybe she was simply a clever and beautiful woman using the gifts God gave her to get done what needed to be done. And if that's the case, there's a lot more women in the world who should be called prophets. But we can't know her state of mind. We can know that Abigail refused to passively stand by when she knew she could do something. She stared down the foolishness of Nabal and the danger of David, and she listened to all the talk, and she said, enough. There had been a lot of talk that day. But of all of it, hers was the only talk that actually made a lasting difference. She brought peace, and she paired action with talk, and it brought perspective, and it made peace, and it saved lives, and it ultimately shaped a future kingdom. We could all use a little more Abigail in our lives. And Nabal thought that it was his property and riches and famous heritage and insults that gave him power. Maybe he grew up believing that was true and nobody had ever told him differently. Maybe he had insulted and belittled people his whole life and nothing serious had ever come of it. Maybe that's how he felt better about himself. Maybe it was how he felt anything. I guess you could chalk Nabal's talk up to foolishness until it incited violence and endangered lives. David, the giant killer, the future king, the mercenary with the army, thought his sword and his reputation gave him power. Because after all, his might and his words, they'd worked before. His anger had served him well. His talk was just anger until it led him down a mountain with a plan to kill an entire household, until his unbridled anger threatened his future. But it was a woman, Abigail, who actually wielded the power of humility, the power of clear thinking, the power of pushing aside all the noise, seeing the bigger picture, and taking a risk to bring about peace. All of us have been each of these characters at some point, haven't we? Nabal, David, Abigail. Each of us at some point have believed that we are entitled to say whatever to whomever, whenever we want. We've spoken without regard to the consequences. All of us have said things we wish we could take back, but once they're out of their mouths, we found them rolling down the mountain and taking on a life and a pain of their own. We could say that Nabal was also the creator of fake news. Nothing he said about David was true, but once he said it, it was out there floating around and finding footholds and growing wherever it could. We've all failed to fact check or consider the ramifications of our own speech or of spreading the speech of others. We've all been Nabal. We've all acted like David. All of us have fallen victim to believing what other people say. We've all fallen victim to the negative voices in our head, like David. Because Nabal wasn't just flinging insults. He may not have known it, but what he said played into David's deepest fears. The fear that he wasn't actually anything more than a simple shepherd, and he never would be. The fear that he was insignificant, nothing more than an imposter who'd gotten a few lucky breaks that would eventually run out. Nabal said out loud what David didn't allow himself to admit he was afraid of. He thought Nabal really saw him, and that's what scared him, and that's what came out as fear dressed in anger. All of us have also responded in anger without thinking. We've all heard or seen something that has made us angry or righteously indignant, and then responded only to later regret it. It's not very often that we feel that way, that we're going to stop and consider if what we're feeling is really anger, or if anger is just masking something else. I wish that we had a glimpse into the rest of Nabal and David's week that week. Perhaps on a different day, Nabal would have welcomed David to his feast and given him all he'd asked for and more. Perhaps on a better day, David could have laughed off Nabal's words as ridiculous and moved on. But whatever narrative was running in their own heads primed them for their reactions on this day. Because how we respond to talk, how we interpret it, how we view that post depends on the soundtrack that's already playing in our heads. Let me give you an example of what I mean. How we interpret talk often depends on the soundtrack we already have playing in our heads, doesn't it? What we hear and what we receive and how we respond depends on what's already going on in us. If we are already listening for more reasons to believe something, we'll hear it. If we're already listening for hate and insults, we'll hear it. If the "you aren't enough" or "you're an imposter" soundtrack is already playing in our heads, suddenly that's what everyone is saying. If we already have a soundtrack of fear, we'll hear fear everywhere. If my soundtrack is possibility and hope, that's what I'm going to hear. We have to learn to pause the soundtrack long enough to cut through the noise and hear what's underneath. And once we do that, we may decide it's time to be silent, and we may decide to just listen, but we may determine it's time, like Abigail, to speak and to act. And all of those ways can be ways of peace. Because talk is cheap until it isn't. Talk is just talk until it hurts someone, or until it causes someone to hurt someone else. Untrue talk is harmless until it becomes truth to someone else, until it crushes a spirit, until it becomes bullying, until it incites violence, until it prompts an insurrection, until it sways an election, until it becomes policy. Sometimes we hear that harmful talk in our own heads, coming out of our own mouths. When we hear talk like that, outside of us or inside of us or coming out of us, when we hear talk like that is no longer just talk, and it's time to say enough. And what we need is a lot more Abigail, the ability to push through the noise and see what's underneath. Thought out, understanding of nuance, peacemaking talk. Talk like that sounds, quite frankly, a little bit more like Jesus. Because there's been a lot of talk these days. There's been a lot of talk about who's right and who's wrong. There's been a lot of insults thrown. There's been a lot of talk about who has plans for good and who has something more nefarious in mind for us and our country. There's been a lot of talk these days about conspiracy. There's been a lot of talk about who's in, who's out, about who's loyal, who's not, who's better, who's lesser, who's smartest, who has the better plan for the future. There's been a lot of talk these days about what rationalizes retaliation, what justifies violence. There's been a lot of talk these days about how bad things have gotten and how good things used to be. There's been a lot of talk about who deserves punishment, who deserves pardon. There's been a lot of talk about the right way to end international conflicts, the way to end gun violence, how to care for the most vulnerable in our midst. There's been a lot of talk these days in my own mind, questioning, am I doing a good job, doing the right thing, whether I'm enough? I am not at all suggesting that simply talk is always the way change is going to come to a more nuanced and complicated situation, of particularly big issues in our world. Because in spite of all the times it's been tried, it hasn't seemed to work in the Middle East. It hasn't seemed to move the needle on AR-15 gun ownership, and it doesn't actually seem to motivate my teens to clean their room. Apparently, Russians realize they can use talk to manipulate a lot of Americans through fake headlines. But just because that feels big doesn't mean that we have to let the loudest voices be the last word and give up. Because once we've pushed through the noise, we have to remember that, on the other hand, voices joined with marching brave men and women to move civil rights forward in this country. Voices joined with collective action, passed marriage equality, and gave all people, regardless of their gender or sexuality, equal access to health care. And once, it gave women the right to make decisions with their own bodies. So it feels like it might be time to say enough, and join our voices and move our feet again. There's a lot of talk these days. There always has been, and it's not going to stop. So what do we do with it? How do we respond to it? What kind of talkers are we? I want to give us some space, some time to actually think about these things, to sit for a few moments and try to cut through the noise. But before we do that, I want to let you know, for those of you that this is important, that the end of the story in David and Abigail and Nabal's story can be found in 1 Samuel chapter 25. Let's take a few moments, Crosspointe, to be still, to listen, to think about talk.
If you would like to know more or get connected to Crosspointe, go to crosspoint.org. If you're in need of care or assistance, go to crosspoint.org/care. And welcome home.